within literally 3 breaths. I mean, literally, you inhale it, and then the third time you already see things turning black and in a hexagonal. So the entire visual field splinters into these hexagonal pieces, and then this sort of black space opens at the center. It looks like a black hole, and you dive in it, and the last sort of thought is, holy shit, what have I done? I'm gonna die. And then it feels like death because you come to this, whatever remains of you, of me in this case. In this case, there was nothing but a very, very bright light, this weird, strange combination of terror and ecstasy. There was no sound, there was no pain, there was no perception of time, no memory, no body, no external world, and you come back to the world. What I discovered by this experience is that it is true, as I'd always assumed, that consciousness of self-consciousness is optional. Yes, we always live within planet ego. Everything is always with respect to me, and me. This self-consciousness is just part of a larger field of consciousness. And in this case, the self was gone, but whatever remained wasn't man or woman or child or God or animal. It simply was. Well, what that teaches you, that self is optional, that you can live you can experience perfectly well without the self.
Today's guest, I'm joined by Dr. Christof Koch, who's a lead scientist at the Allen Institute and has been a pioneer in the field of consciousness research. He is the author of the latest book, Then I Am Myself, the World. In this interview, we'll cover the most recent adversarial collaboration on consciousness studies, but really looking at Dr. Christof's work, his life experience, and we're going to kind of get into sort of the topics such as psychedelics, idealism, and really the future of consciousness research. So please welcome Christof.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jason, for having me.
So thank you, Christof, for coming on. And I have to thank Liz for reaching out to me and setting this interview up. I was very excited. And as I mentioned, Christof, our audience is really, the general public, but interested in where science can kind of connect to these, thousands of years of philosophy in understanding the nature of consciousness, right? And you've called yourself a romantic reductionist, which I love, right? Balancing the left brain with the right brain, emotions and logic. And, especially the title of your book, right? Then I Am Myself, the World, is actually taken from, Richard Wagner's famous opera, right? About two lovers coming together and joining as one, and
becoming part of the universe. They have what we today call a mystical experience. Yes. The second act of that opera to the most rapturous music in the Western canon.
And I love that because I think you sort of tie the themes of subjective experience grounded in, holistic reductionist reasoning. So to help us start off, Christof, to help us answer the question of what is consciousness, because you've defined it using as qualia, but also as something that has neurological correlation to the brain, as we understand. And science is trying to understand that. So in a balanced sense, where we can understand consciousness as both qualia rich and causally real without collapsing it into sort of one pure thing, how can you help us understand what consciousness is?
Well, first of all, just to reify what I mean by consciousness, it's any experience. I don't like to use these philosophical, very laden words like qualia. Right now, I hear you and I see you and I feel my body. I just come from a workout, so I can feel I'm a little bit aroused, etc. Those are all conscious experiences. Tonight, I'm going to go to sleep and my consciousness will disappear, particularly in the early part of the night. I go into deep sleep. When there isn't any consciousness, I don't exist for myself anymore. And then I wake up inside my sleeping brain and I have other experiences. We call those dreams. They're different from waking consciousness, but you're highly conscious. You can love and hate and fear and have all sorts of other adventures. And so the challenge has always been how to explain these subjective states. They're subjective and private. So private, that means I never directly access your states. right? I can live with someone for our entire life. We can have our bodies interpenetrate in making love, but I don't fundamentally access the states of someone else. All I have is what they say, when they say I love you, or I can see their body, how they respond, how the body responds to me, but I don't have access to the conscious state, which is why so many scientists for so long said, "Oh, we can't study it because it's not what philosophers refer to as first. It's a third person. It's not accessible to another person." So, and that's true. That's what makes consciousness different from studying black holes and bodies and viruses. But that doesn't mean we should just forget about it and just not worry about it, because it is a central part of my existence. In fact, channeling René Descartes, I'm conscious, therefore I exist. The only way I know I exist is because I feel I have a body. I can project myself in the future. I remember things in the past, etc. Now we know, as you pointed out, unlike previous culture, they said, well, I love you with all my heart. Well, we know actually love, the feeling of love, I can have a heart transplant and I still will love my wife the way I did before, because we know the substrate of it, the correlate of it, what the material substrate that seems to be necessary to express a feeling of love is in my brain. In fact, it's probably a combination of hypothalamus and prefrontal cortex. So for Valentine's Day, you could give your sweetie a little chocolate, brain-shaped chocolate rather than a heart-shaped chocolate, but we still have this cardiac-laden language. So we can try to identify what are the footprints of consciousness in the brain. Is it this structure, that structure? Is it the spinal cord? Is it the retina when we see, etc.? And that's ongoing, and we'll probably talk later about it. But then, even once we have the physical substrate, sort of the final, what we call neural correlates of consciousness, even let's say we know in the fullness of time, it's these neurons over here doing this thing at that frequency, using those genes and expressing those proteins. Well, why these and not those? Why this frequency, not that frequency, right? Why in fact, who else has conscious experience? Because if I go to the foundational equation of physics, quantum mechanics and relativity, it says nothing about consciousness. If I go to the periodic table of elements in chemistry, it says nothing about consciousness. If I look at the genes, the endless ATGC chat of my genes, nothing about consciousness. Yet here we are, we all wake up to this world and we're conscious. So where does consciousness come in? That's sort of been the central, the heart of what's called the mind-body problem that philosophers and other scholars and now scientists have been after for scientists only over the last 100 years, but philosophers, of course, since ancient times.
Right. And I love how you sort of laid that out, Christof, because it really sets the stage for our conversation in sort of the challenge, but also, again, intertwined with the philosophy and just the nature of human experience and what you talk about love, right? So I think this is such a great conversation because for the average person to, even though they can't read these studies, I think what we can take away from this conversation is just the pure awe and the wonder and the experience of how did all this random biology and physics create us that also happen to have consciousness too. So as we transition to that, speaking of ancient cultures and histories of philosophies of talking about consciousness, psychedelics have been used for hundreds, thousands of years. And you personally had a profound experience with 5-MeO DMT. And for the audience, you've said on interviews that you said the world was gone, there was no Christof, right? Your personal identity was stripped away. There was nothing but the awfulness of the naked experience of consciousness itself. So can you bring us back to that moment where you were experiencing all that? And from your framework as a scientist, how did that evolve for you? How was that experience and how did that inform your approach to consciousness?
Okay, well, so first of all, I come to psychedelics only late in life. So I've studied consciousness and its neural correlates for the last 35 years. As a scientist, in people, in normal, everyday, regular folks, in patients that have lost consciousness maybe, and in closely related animals. Over the last 10 years, obviously, particularly since the book of Michael Pollan appeared, conscious psychedelics have been so much talked about in the context of consciousness. People use the language, it is expanded consciousness. Well, what does it mean? And I felt as a student of consciousness, you've got to take the motto of the Royal Society of London, the oldest scientific society in the world. Take no one's word for it. You have to experience it yourself. So I tried various things. And here I find myself in the early days of the pandemic inhaling a substance. And what's of course remarkable about so this is called the toad. It's in this case it was directly secreted from the gland of a turtle of a toad. Within literally 3 breaths. I mean, literally, you inhale it, and then the third time you already see things turning black and in a hexagonal. So the entire visual field splinters into these hexagonal pieces. And then this sort of black space opens at the center. It looks like a black hole, and you dive in it. And the last sort of thought is, holy shit, what have I done? I'm going to die. And then it feels like death because you come to this, whatever remains of you, or of me in this case, um, comes to in this space when there is very little. There are three things, three distinctions. So normally consciousness is very rich. I can see you, I can hear you, I can feel the chair. There's left, there's right, there's up, there's down, there's a monitor, there's all this stuff in my environment. In this case, there was nothing but a very, very bright light. Now, some people interpret it as light at the end of a tunnel. For me, it was just a bright light. It seemed like perceptually from a purely descriptive point of view, all of space had collapsed into a singularity that was overwhelmingly bright, and there wasn't any space, so I couldn't look away because there wasn't a way. There wasn't left, right, up, down. There was just this point of very, very bright light. And then there was terror and ecstasy, this weird, strange combination of terror and ecstasy. There was no sound, there was no pain, there was no perception of time. So, unlike now, we always feel time flows, faster or slower, depending on how interesting it is for us. Here, this moment wasn't too long or too short. It simply was. Um, Nothing else, no memory, no body, no external world. And people who observed me said, yeah, I was sitting there with eyes wide open, but none of that sort of was what people call a complete dissociative state. Um, and then in a timeless moment, by the clock, it was roughly 10 minutes, you come back to the world. In this case, the first thing I heard was this piece of music they had put on for me. And what I discovered by this experience is that it is true, as I'd always assumed, that consciousness of self-consciousness is optional. Yes, we always live within planet ego, right? Everything is always with respect to me, and me. But this self-consciousness is just part of a larger field of consciousness. And in this case, the self was gone, but whatever remained wasn't man or woman or child or God or animal. It simply was. So what that teaches you, that self is optional, that you can live perfectly, you can experience perfectly well without the self. And then the other side, the other benefit. So for me, as a scholar of consciousness, that was very important. The other thing I took from it, but I only realized this many weeks later. I mean, the experience is so intense that there isn't a single day that you don't think about this experience and what it means. Um, the other thing, it totally took away the fear of death. So, as you get older, you might lie in bed when you have difficult sleeping and think about death and what happens beyond death, and you're dead forever and ever. And this existential vertigo opens. It's just like as a climber, you look down into an abyss and it has no bottom. But all of that, those thoughts are gone. So somehow, it's not that I want to die, but I'm simply not afraid of death anymore. So in that sense, it was a rather um, interesting experience. Although I will never ever do it again.
Yeah, that sounds like a roller coaster near death trip of a lifetime. And what I hear you say, Christoph, is especially for those that haven't ever experienced psychedelics, and I love what you say is that the self concept of our own consciousness being what we think limited to this body and this mind is optional. And I think that lens to your experience of saying like you're not afraid of death, because this, as research has shown, people that undergo these psychedelic experiences, it changes them. It changes them to, like you said, that they're no longer afraid of death, and they also experience these profound lifestyle changes to the way they think and see and feel in life. And for the most part, they do better, right? Especially when we talk about mental health and things like that.
So we have to say, Jason, of course, these are very powerful tools, medicines, and they don't have the same experience, even on the same person, even if you do it, let's say, a month later, right? It's highly variable, set and setting. And we simply don't understand right now why, the same person taking the same substance a month later may have a very different experience. And of course, it's also true that for some people, these can be terrifying and leaving lasting terror, PTSD, right? So one just has to, yeah, just emphasize these are powerful substances and they ought to be taken with supervision and with a lot of care. If you do that, so for example, all the clinical trials of psilocybin magic mushrooms, there has never been a single documented, as far as I know, severe adverse effect in a clinical trial where people get screened. They get screened for schizophrenia and other mental disorders. There's always someone there. So one should be careful doing this, in the wild, as it were. But yes, it can be
Absolutely.
profoundly transformative. And I think what's key to a transformative experience, so I had a second such experience using, this was in Brazil, a very different set and setting. What's key to these transformative experience is the loss of self. So just like an astronaut, very rare, but as an astronaut, you go up there and you sort of escape the Earth's gravitation field. Well, or strictly speaking, you're still in it, but you keep on falling, which we experience as you go around the planet, which we experience as weightlessness. And same thing these experiences can be transformative to the extent that you lose your sense of self. We always hold on. That's what I mean. We always live within the gravitational attraction of the self. It's always about me, 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 me. And then, by the way, me. And when you can lose that, either by meditation or by taking these medicines or any other way, you can have experience that truly transform you for the better, as you say.
Yes, and you've mentioned meditation, and I've looked into the science of how meditation makes you selfless, right? Becoming more generous, and the idea that
More
we're
compassionate.
more than just this container of consciousness, right? And the analogy I think of, because I subscribe, closely to idealism, panpsychism, is that consciousness can be fluid, and depending on the container of which we will talk about with the integrated information theory, things can change in your way of unifying consciousness, and how cohesive it can change. So with that being said, thank you for sharing that. And I want to move us to the next part, which is sort of the longest collaboration on adversarial testing on consciousness theories. And this was a profound project, to say the least, and with hundreds of different scientists and hundreds of participants. So, Christof, for the average person out there, can you just tell us the inspiration behind this research project and the simplified explanation between those two theories, and what did the results show for us?
Okay, so first of all, it is true of almost all science that people have a particular idea or hypothesis or theory they're testing. And funnily enough, what gets out there in the published press, 90% of the time, it verifies my idea. It's extremely rare for scientists to say ahead of time, well, I believe X, and then he says, up, I tested X and X isn't true. So in some sense, it's self-fulfilling for various reasons. These are the biases that scientists, after all, are just regular people. They have emotions, they have careers, they have emotional entanglement with their theories that they spent the last 20 years pushing. And so to try to counteract that, we got together here with the Templeton Foundation, or the Templeton World Charity Foundation in Bahamas. They funded this. We had a meeting here in Seattle, in fact, at the Allen Institute, 7 years ago in 2018, where we got together two of the proponents of the two leading theories of consciousness. This is integrated information theory, which sort of starts with consciousness as a fundamental feature of existence. versus global neuronal workspace theory that sort of says, well, there is a brain, it has certain, and a mind that has certain features and properties, and let's try to squeeze the juice of consciousness out of what we think the mind is, the mind does. Um, and and let's get these two theories and theoreticians together in one room, and let's agree on doing some experiments. Can we find some common ground where we agree on a set of experiments, where we test them, where we ahead of time specify if this outcome is in this way, it supports one theory, and if it's in a different way, it supports the other theory. This is not easy to do because you have to sort of play through all possibilities ahead of time and say, what happens if we find this? What happens if we find that? It was pre-registered. That means you specify in great detail what exact experiment are you doing and what exact mathematical tool or algorithm or statistics you're going to use to evaluate that. We did all of that, and then, as you said, was a large collaboration involving 12 labs in 3 continents over 7 years. In the meantime, of course, COVID hit, involving 256 regular folks and some patients who just had to look at things. So here we're studying visual consciousness. So they, one at a time, things appeared, line drawings of objects and faces, and a toaster or a font of a letter or number appeared. And sometimes you had to recognize them and name them, and sometimes you didn't. And there were 3 specific predictions that the 2 theories agreed upon. One was in the realm of where does consciousness occur? Very crudely put, does it occur in the front of the brain? That's sort of maximally expanded compared to other mammals, closely related mammals like the great apes. The front of our lobes are sort of really characteristic for Homo sapiens. They're maximally expanded in us compared to all other mammals. Or are they more in the back, associated with sensory processing, with visual processing? What is the timing of the onset of this activity that we see? Does it roughly agree with the onset and the offset of your conscious experience, as it should? And these neurons, we all hypothesize that all the neurons whose activity represents your conscious sight or thought should have some internal communication code. And so 2 of the 3 predictions went in favor of this theory, integrated information theory, this consciousness first theory, namely the footprint of visual consciousness are primarily in the back. The front doesn't seem to be necessary for seeing. Now, the front is necessary for speaking, for responding, for attending, for planning, for reasoning. Those are all important things. You don't want to lose the front of your brain, but they're not consciousness. In fact, they're much more closely tied to intelligence, which is interesting in light of artificial intelligence and artificial consciousness. So let me say that again differently. So it seems to me that the footprint of consciousness, of seeing, hearing, having a sense of self, having a sense of agency, I'm now going to raise my right hand to make a point, that those are in the back. Well, things that are associated with what would be called reasoning tend to be more in the front. But then the third prediction is that both theories, particularly integrated information theory, made this postulate that these neurons need to carry this internal code of synchronization, and that was not found. So it's 2 for 1. And more experiments are ongoing. So there are 5 of these adversarial collaboration. It's called adversarial because you have adversaries. I mean, conceptually they're adversaries. These 2 theories are very different, but it's a collaboration as you're trying to get together and agree ahead of time on the rules and what experiment are you going to do, which is very difficult. In fact, there was a big backlash, and there was accusation of pseudoscience and all of that. There was a letter being sent, all sorts of things. Yes. So we have a little bit of what Dan Kahneman, the economist and Nobel laureate who wrote Think Fast, Think Slow, called angry science. Because people, again, aren't going to, if you spend 20 years building up a particular theory, you aren't going to say, you got me, you're right. The experiment proves me I'm wrong. I wasted 25 years of my life. It's okay. I don't mind. People don't do that. People don't respond to that.
Right. And it connects back to why the adversarial collaboration framework is so important because, like you said, there's bias. Because although scientists try to use the scientific method as best as possible, still you can,
It's lots of bias.
yes,
It's
you
lots of
can work
bias.
your way to proving something. So yeah, I was just listening to Bernardo Kastrup's talking about that and how they called IIT, pseudoscience because it's based on fundamentally what you're talking about, this subjective component, which is hard to pin down. And so, just to kind of recap there, though, you mentioned there was no clear winner, but IIT, as Kastrup says, is the best game in town.
No,
Um,
IIT, I think, is the best theory we have right now of consciousness and its footprints. Now, it has a number of very surprising implications. So, it's very, for better or worse, it's very precise how it defines. It has a very specific explanation in mind that's very mathematical abstract. It says consciousness ultimately is causal power. It's the ability of any mechanism, like a brain, to determine its own, to be determined by its immediate past and to determine its own future because it has causal power. That just means if you have a mechanism like a brain or in principle a computer, the current state, its current state, these neurons off and those neurons on will determine its next state. And because the brain is so complicated, it has immense amount of causal power, which per the theory translate into immense amount of consciousness. But it also makes some profoundly counterintuitive predictions. So for instance, it predicts in line with this ancient belief called panpsychism that maybe consciousness is in many more systems than we like to think. So not only in cats and dogs and other critters, but maybe even in single cells. It may well feel like something to be a paramecium. Now, the paramecium doesn't have a voice in its head. The paramecium is unlikely to know about the weekend or the stock market. But because the molecular interactions of all the millions of proteins inside a single cell are already so vastly complex, it may well feel like something to be alive as a paramecium. And once it dies, once its cell membranes dissolves, it may not feel like anything anymore. So in fact, that was called out in this letter, letter that accused us of being pseudoscience. Some scientists instinctively revolt against that. This idea that's very widespread in many philosophies that consciousness may be much more widespread. It also makes certain predictions about computers, that in particular that current day computers, not neuromorphic computers, computers built in the image of the brain, nor quantum computers, but conventional von Neumann machine as we have them today in our cloud and on our wrist and in our pockets, they may able to mimic consciousness, so they can deep fake it. They can, if you talk to a chat GPT, it's very impressive. 4.0, right? You can have extended discussion and you can ask it about its consciousness and it'll give you detailed answers. Why? Well, because it's read every novel written by humans. And of course, most novels are about feelings. And so it can regurgitate all of that. But that doesn't, of course, mean that it feels like anything. In fact, if you apply the theory to this sort of hardware, it tells you, no, it doesn't feel like anything to be a chat GPT. So some of these conclusions are counterintuitive, run counter, particularly to the zeitgeist that believes that we are on the threshold of having machine consciousness, and so runs counter to that deeply held belief by many in the tech industry.
Yeah, and that's a huge topic for now. And speaking of artificial intelligence and whether it can achieve sentience and feeling, right? I think that's such a fascinating and fast evolving field that I'm sure you and Bernardo Kastrups have been talking about, and will talk about for the next decade there. And speaking of this concept of integrated information theory, right? And I know the measurement for interconnectedness is by this value called phi. And from my basic understanding, right, if there's a higher phi value, it means that the system tends to can is more integrated, more unified, and can have more of an expansive conscious experience. So applying that framework, if I'm correct,
Yeah, that's
to
correct.
account for your psychedelic experience, it now help us understand, do we expect IIT to show increased phi in people undergoing these psychedelic experiences to account for that expansive
It's not
consciousness?
quite clear because, I mean, so you have to, we know very little about the brain bases right now of these psychedelics. The little that we do know seems to show that it slows down the high frequency activity you can see in EEG in brain waves becomes much less pronounced. In fact, there's one paper I'm thinking of where they gave subjects 5-MeO, DMT, and there you get these profound, very slow, low frequencies. So it's not clear why that should lead to enhanced consciousness, to expanded consciousness, to expanded phi, this number that you mentioned that sort of is a quantitative measure of consciousness. So that's somewhat of a mystery. If that's the case, why do people universally describe consciousness under these conditions? Now, mind you, I did not have a mystical experience. I had something closer to a near-death experience, which is different from a mystical. I had a mystical experience where, in fact, the title of this book, as we talked about, comes from a second experience I had, where you feel, well, where whatever remains of you disappears, the borders between, normally there's a border between me and the rest of the world. So I know exactly when I, for example, hold this can of water, I know what my hand is, and I know what the non-self is, the can, right? I know where that boundary is. But under some of these medicines, that boundary can disappear, and then you merge literally. I mean, that's the experience you have with the universe. You become one with the universe. It's a profound feeling, and this happened only 2 years ago. It fundamentally changed me in more ways than my near-death experience, because it fundamentally shook the tectonic plates of my metaphysics. And Jason, I can assure you, sort of when you come to my age, your metaphysics is pretty firmly established. You know what you know what you believe, and you everything else sort of is, you think is woo-woo. But now suddenly you find yourself, or whatever remains, because again, there is no self. Christof is gone, but you feel you're one with the universe, and so you question sort of the physicalism that I grew up with and that I've always had as a scientist. So physicalism is pure and simple the belief that ultimately what truly exists is matter. So it used to be called materialism. But then early on in the 20th century, it included matter and energy and space and time and information, things like that. So that's known as physicalism. And there's nothing else that truly exists in a fundamental way except physical stuff, okay? But then it meets when you have this experience where you feel, no, I've now had direct acquaintance with, that's the term. You bring back what William James, the father of American psychology, calls this noetic knowledge. You bring back special knowledge. I know no one else can take this away from me. I have direct experience of the universe as this mental entity. And then I'm still a scientist. I'm still, what I think of as a rational person. So I try to combine what I know about physics and, allied sciences with my experience. And then as I said, you begin to go beyond physicalism, because physicalism also has two big challenges that Bernardo Kostrub talks about. Physicalism has been utterly unable to explain consciousness. Okay, so how does the seemingly mental, my feeling of pain, how does this come about? And it's more than just neurons firing, because neurons firing don't have pain. This thing, this earbud, that doesn't have pain, it doesn't have love, but this mechanism, and my brain is a part of the universe, subject to the same laws as anything else, right? We don't have one set of laws for brains and then a different set of laws for everything else. It's all part of the furniture. So it's all subject to quantum mechanics, but still, we have been utterly unable to explain. So some philosophers call this the explanatory gap, the hard problem, how consciousness arises out of the physical. And people say, well, don't worry. Well, in the fullness of time. Yeah, in the fullness of time. That's like some people say, ultimately, there's going to be a rapture. Well, okay, yes, in the fullness of time, there could be a rapture, or there could be an explanation for consciousness, but I don't have a luxury to attend for that. That promise is empty. That doesn't help me because I don't know what the future description, maybe the future description of physics will include the mental. That's one problem. The other problem is we used to know what matter is. So physicalism really comes from materialism, which really comes from René Descartes saying there's two sorts of stuff. There's mental stuff and there's stuff that has extension, size, length, width, mass, etc. But now with quantum mechanics, we don't really know what matter is, because now we have this strange situation that things can be indefinite, that they don't have a definite state. They don't have a specific mass. They have possible all sorts of masses simultaneously. And then this new thing called entanglement, where you can have two systems, let's say two entangled photons that can be in opposite ends of the Earth or in opposite ends of the universe. And as soon as I observe one, the state of the other one's instantaneously determined, independent of the distance. Although it's certainly not my grandfather's materialism or physicalism anymore. And so maybe now there's a movement afoot in fundamental physics. Maybe we do really have to include a description of consciousness and of the observer into our fundamental description of reality. And then ideas like idealism, which is very different from panpsychism, right? So idealism says fundamentally everything is mental. It's sort of the opposite of physicalism, right? There are really two poles. Western mind-body philosophy is revolved around two poles. One pole is the physical, the other pole is the mental. So physicalist says only the physical exists. Idealism says everything fundamental is mental, and even a thing like this here ultimately has to be explained as the outcome of something mental. Then there is dualism that says, well, that's sort of what most people believe, dualism. Well, there's physical and there's the mental. But then the challenge is, how does the physical and the mental interact? Then there's panpsychism, which says everything physical also has another aspect, has a mental aspect. Everything has two things. It has two aspects. It's like everything has windows to the inside. That's how it feels like to be this physical system. And a window to the outside, that's how it interacts with other physical systems. So these are ancient beliefs that have been totally exiled from the academe until recently, which was completely dominated by analytical philosophy that takes the physical as granted. But now I and other people are thinking, well, maybe we have to go beyond physicalism, which immediately gets you accused of delving into the woo-woo and having lost it.
Right. And it's a total paradigm shift, as you know, Christof. Look at history and looking at the solar system and whether the world revolved around the sun or everything else revolved around the world, right? I think we're on that cusp of this sort of post-materialistic paradigm shifting event that's been building up for many years. I think what I appreciate about this conversation is that you have this holistic lens, especially as a scientist, right, to appreciate and to see all these different perspectives. And I have to ask, because as a scientist using the scientific method, there must be a neural substrate for consciousness, right? Otherwise, you can't do science. There's no substrate, there's no brain, no mind, right? But on a recent interview with the Essentia Foundation, Hans Bustra asked, Bernardo Kastrup and the same question, and he says that, that the dashboard is not complete, and he argues that the empirical method, by design, may never access the whole picture. So we shouldn't, and naturally speaking, logically speaking, expect the neural measurements to capture everything about conscious experience. And Hans, called it a cop-out answer. So if you can respond to that.
Bernardo has this beautiful metaphor with your pilot in a plane. You don't directly access the environment, but you have all this dashboard. You have a wind meter and you know about the temperature and the pressure and the speed and all of that. And then after a while, because if you grew up in this cockpit and you're going to die in this cockpit and you never leave this cockpit, of course you're taking the what your sensors, the dashboard, as reality, because it's the only reality right? Unless there's certain events like maybe some of these mystical experiences where you directly access the outside world and you say, holy Maloney, it's radically different than what I thought it was. Now the dashboard still exists, so there is a substrate. There's no question that you can start here. Okay, this is it. This is a typical size. It's a facsimile of a real human brain. This exists. I'm not doubting that this doesn't exist. But this may be, just like everything else, may ultimately be the expression of a mental process that analyzes everything. So you can study this using good old physics and chemistry and neuroscience, and you can find laws and manipulate and build mRNA vaccines or brain-machine interfaces. All of that's a given. But ultimately, what truly exists may not be this, but maybe this fundamental mental and this fundamental mental entity. But you can still proceed as a scientist. And by the way, this is also not identical to the belief in a God. This form of idealism says no. This fundamental mental entity that constitutes everything, including our own conscious mind, evolves using some internal dynamics, but it's not supernatural. There isn't an entity that sits there, an old man that has a beard and that watches and interferes with the universe. No, this mental entity has its own dynamics that we in principle we can try to infer, that is lawful using its own laws that we may not we may probably only understand in a peaceful manner. So it's not a religious belief. It just means, where do you put the primacy? Is the primacy on stuff that's physical, or do you believe that ultimately it's mental? And then, Jason, this comes to an important point that Bernardo also makes. The only thing you know, and the only thing I don't know about atoms. I don't know about mass. I don't know about energy and all of that. The only thing I know is things are heavy, other things are lighter, things are blue. I hear things, right? So even a scientist has to look at an ampere meter, has to look at an oscilloscope, right? Ultimately, the only way we access the world, including our own internal world of our body, is through phenomenal experience, is through experiences. So isn't it then easier just to say, yeah, it's phenomena all the way out. There's nothing else but phenomena, rather than saying, well, there's phenomena and then there's real things like matter. But then this, as I said, it fails to explain how these particular phenomena arise.
Yeah, it's quite the just expansive story and journey that you talk about, Christof, because this really puts things into the perspective of the nature of existence itself, from an ontological perspective
Yes,
that we
what
try
truly
to
exists? What truly exists?
answer.
So again, this is where the two theories that we talked about differ fundamentally, because one theory says what truly exists in an absolute sense is consciousness. Only consciousness exists for itself. So what I mean by that is, again, if we come back to the fact that you and I are going to go tonight, we're going to go to bed and we will disappear. Christof will disappear if I have a good night's sleep, particularly early on. There will be a moment when suddenly Christof is gone, no more. Now, the body of Christof's brain is still be there, and my wife can look at, can look at my sleeping body and see me move and breathe, etc. But I don't exist for myself. And then I come through in the world of dreams or when I wake up. So the only true existence is existence for itself. Everything else is secondary, is derivative. This box here of my ear pod only exists for it. It does not exist for itself. This only exists for others. That's a big difference between intrinsic and extrinsic existence. Existing for itself, which applies to a cat or dog or any other conscious creatures, and existing for others, which applies to bodies, to stars, to viruses, to brains. They only exist for others.
Yeah, and that's a good way to kind of ground us, back to the conversation of what we understand as sentience and speaking of agency, right? Because you speak about how part of consciousness is to have this agency, this causal power to transform and to change, which connects back to Michael Levin's work. I want to touch a little bit about, because I come from the perspective of what's called the biofield, which is this field of invisible energy and information that influences health, and it's most connectly grounded with Michael Levin's work on bioelectricity, which is very interesting because some of his experiments have showed like cells seem to behave as if they're following an internal blueprint, communicating across these bioelectric gradients, which is almost like a non-neural nervous system. So I'd be curious on your comments on Michael Levin's work in that?
Yeah, I don't know enough about. I mean, I've met him several times. I've visited his lab. I study electric fields in the brain. Okay, this is my expertise from a biophysical point of view. So there's no question there's fields in the brain. You can stick an electrode on top of the scalp. You get an EEG, right? It's clearly there. You can put a micro machine silicon probe into the brain, whether it's a human or an animal, doesn't really matter. And you can see change. You can see a gradient, changes in voltage, and you can see how this affects everything. In fact, the brain communicates using electric fields, right? Action potential, for example, is a rapid change in voltage, tenths of a volt that neuron use to communicate. His discovery involves that it may not only be neurons. In fact, you can ask from a fundamental physical point of view, why it seems to me that only the brain has conscious experience, not my liver or my heart, right? Although my heart also has electrical, you can pick up with an EKG, you can pick up the electrical signals, right, due to the contraction of the cardiac muscle, or the liver also has electrical potential. It's made out of the same sort of bilipid stuff with proteins in it, etc. So why does a heart not feel like anything, or why does the liver not feel like anything, or does it? But we don't know about it. So the reality is there are these fields, and what his work teaches us that there's probably much more to these fields than we conventionally think of. We think the gradients are relatively small across neurons and typically don't do anything except they signal this rapid action potential way how neurons communicate with each other. But it may be important for early on for development to guide, particularly to guide neurons or to guide cells into their places. The electric field is important. There's now this entire field of electric fields where you can begin to manipulate, where people begin to manipulate the fields for various beneficial effects. It's still early days. On the other hand, we live, surrounded by electric fields, and most of the time they don't seem to do too much to us. So that's not quite clear. You can live next to a power line underneath a, 110 kilovolt transmission line. Yeah, and there may be some evidence that there may be a little bit enhanced probability of getting cancer, but by and large, your consciousness isn't disrupted, right? You can perfectly well talk and reasonably interact next to a power line. So it's not clear. There's so much we don't understand. The universe is a big place, and we're only beginning to understand it. That's what I would say.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that input, just because I come from this biofield research, and it's fascinating for me as a clinician that studied acupuncture and how acupuncture has, the physiology involved, but also this mysticism of consciousness and being connected, one with the universe. So I always find that, especially Michael Levin's work is so interesting, and especially to hear your comments on that. To close, Christof, we've covered a huge gamut here, right? In terms of the definition of consciousness, your own personal experiences with psychedelics, right? And this latest, largest adversarial collaboration on, the two major leading theories of consciousness, and covering, idealism with Bernardo Kastrup and, Michael Levin's work. Where do you see, after all this, after your years of experience in this field, where do you see the future of consciousness research and science going? Because it seems like it's going to have to be very collaborative on an even higher level to show what we hopefully want to see or can prove.
Well, I mean, we now live through this new renaissance that AI gives us, this very powerful tool. So, for instance, I mean, it'll go in all sorts of directions. One direction, for instance, detecting consciousness. So to many people, the topics we discuss sound very airy-fairy, idealism, panpsychism. Okay, what does that mean for me? Very concrete is, if one of us now steps outside of the studio and gets hit by a truck, we end up in the ICU. And if we are behavioral unresponsive, we lie there, our eyes may be wide open, so our brain is clearly not dead. We're not brain dead, we're alive, but we don't respond, right? If people ask you, sir, can you hear me? Can you track with your eyes? They pinch you very hard to your own towards a painful stimulus, none. Then we assume the patient is unconscious, and there are tens of thousands of these vegetative state or behavioral unresponsive patients around at any given point in time. After 3 to 5 to 6 to 7 days, the clinical team will initiate with the relatives a discussion. Is this what they would have wanted? And 70 to 90% of the time, they decide no and they pull the ventilator support. Now we know that in 25% of these cases, there was this huge recent study, was covered by front page New York Times, Wall Street Journal, that the 25% of these people are covertly conscious. They're actually conscious, they experience the world to a certain extent, but they can't communicate because the injury destroyed those parts of the brain that allow them to think or to talk about it. So we want practical tools. So that's one way where we're going to go. Practical tools to detect consciousness in people that can't signal it, to determine what happens in those patients, what happens at the end of life, what happens at the beginning of life, when does consciousness actually start? First term, second term, third term, when the baby is born. So that's one direction. People are exploring the boundaries. To what extent is quantum mechanics relevant? So we talked very little bit about quantum mechanics. The vast majority of neuroscientists believe that, and I sort of also, that used to be my bias, that the brain is wet and warm. So it's very unlikely for these fancy quantum effects like entanglement and superposition that are the basis of quantum computers to be realized in the brain. But we don't know. And anything that's not ruled out by the laws of physics could be exploited by natural selection. So there's there. Then there is this field of machine consciousness, which is different from machine intelligence, right? How do they relate? Is a machine that's intelligent also conscious? Most certainly not. Can we build conscious artificial machine? Is this a good thing to do? So there are lots of different directions. The science of consciousness will go. It'll simultaneously, of course, move into all of these different directions. It's wonderful because when I got my PhD 40 years ago, you couldn't talk about this. You could not talk as a scientist about consciousness. It was certainly not before you obtained the holy state of tenure. And that's really changed now.
Yeah.
So it's exciting time to be studying this.
Amazing. I and many people are glad that you rebelled and did not follow Francis Crick and the conventional knowledge of, you kind of have to do this, right? Before you start venturing out and talking
Into
about
the unknown.
this crazy stuff here. Yes. But really grateful for your work, Christof. Really grateful for you sharing your time and your knowledge and experience for just the general audience as well, and putting it in a practical way, right? As you mentioned, with measuring consciousness in these people that are in comas, right? To the profound implications of not only saving someone that is still conscious,
yes,
but leaving the ventilator on for someone that's not, right? So that's the other, I think, aspect that Bernardo Kastrup talks about too. So huge implications there. And finally, just to close off, with your immense experience, years of knowledge and wisdom, and as a scientist, and as you call yourself, a romantic reductionist, if you could go back in time with all the knowledge and the experiences you have now, and you have 1 minute to talk to 10-year-old Christof Koch, what would be the most important thing you would tell him?
Never cease to be amazed by existence itself. The mere fact that we exist. And I hadn't appreciated that for the longest, right? Because surely it's the most natural thing for there to be nothing. But we find ourselves in this extraordinary universe, with people and colors and dogs and trees around, and that the sheer miracle of existence. And then, if you contemplate it, it's profoundly beautiful. Yes, there's all sorts of good things and bad things happening, but just being alive and appreciating all of this every single minute that we are alive and trying to understand it, never cease exploring.
Yes, well said. And my motto too, an attitude of gratitude makes the world and yourself a better place. Just to appreciate the simple things that
indeed,
we
Jason.
tend to take for granted.
Gratitude for existence, yes, and for each other.
Thank you so much, Christof. An amazing conversation. I'm sure we can talk for hours and hours on end, especially from my end. And for people that want to learn more about your work and find your book, where can they reach?
You can just, then I myself, the world, you can just, find it on Amazon or in bookstores. You can go to my website, christofkoch.com. You can just Google my name. Yes. Thank you for having me, Jason. Greatly appreciate.
Absolutely, Christof. So hopefully this will be first of many interviews to come as you explore the exciting field of consciousness on the very frontier. And just as an enthusiast, not an expert in this field, I think that one thing that you can take away from this conversation is that a lot of people are looking up to you and other scientists as well, and the amazing work that you're doing. So appreciation and gratitude from my end.
Thank you.
All right,
All right.
Christof, take care.
Take care.